The worst snowstorm in years swept through the Appalachia region like a white monster, swallowing every road in Beckley, West Virginia, plunging the entire town into darkness as power was completely cut off and temperatures dropped to levels that could kill a person after just a few minutes outside. In the old wooden house at the end of Maple Hollow, 11-year-old Emma Grace Carter, who lived with her gravely ill grandfather, woke up startled when she heard 3 heavy knocks on the door amid the fierce howling wind outside the porch. When she tremblingly opened the door, she saw 5 snow-covered Hells Angels bikers standing close together in the freezing wind, and a young man named Lucas, clutching his blood-soaked arm, as if he might collapse at any moment. Emma understood that if she closed that door, those men might not survive until dawn. But the little girl had no idea that the giant man leading the group of bikers would change her life and the entire town of Beckley the next morning. Beckley was once one of the most bustling coal mining towns in southern West Virginia, where lines of coal trucks stretched through the night and lights from small roadside bars stayed on until dawn to welcome workers off their shifts from the mines. But years of economic decline had drained the life from the place like water receding from a drying river. Abandoned factories stood silent under the gray sky, the windows of old stores covered in dust, and rusted signs creaked in the biting winter wind. Many families had left Beckley to find work in Ohio or Pennsylvania, leaving behind dark, empty houses and streets so deserted that sometimes Emma could stand in the middle of Main Street in the late afternoon without seeing a single car pass by. At the end of Maple Hollow, near the edge of the southern forest, was the small wooden house of Emma Grace Carter and her grandfather Walter Carter, an old house with peeling white paint, a porch roof sagging under the snow, and a crooked mailbox that Walter had promised to fix for 3 years but never had the strength to do. Emma was only 11 years old, but her gray-blue eyes carried the weariness of someone who had lived too long with loss. Her mother had died of an overdose when Emma was just 6 years old after years of struggling with painkillers and addiction. And her father had disappeared from Beckley just a few months after the funeral without leaving any news. Emma still remembered clearly the last evening she saw her father, when he stood on the porch with an old bag over his shoulder and said he would be back in a few weeks, but he never returned. Since then, Walter was the only one she had left. He was a Vietnam veteran before working as a coal miner for nearly 30 years in the deep tunnels beneath the Appalachian Mountains. The long years of breathing coal dust had ruined his lungs, making every winter feel like a new battle with his own breath. There were nights when Walter coughed so violently that Emma had to sit beside him for hours just to make sure he could still breathe. Emma was used to waking up at 5 in the morning to light the wood stove before the sky fully brightened. The little girl pulled on her old worn-out boots and went out to the backyard, knocked the frozen snow off the woodpile, and carried each log inside while her breath turned into white smoke in front of her. Then she prepared medicine for Walter, boiled hot water, and tried to make breakfast from whatever was left in the refrigerator. Emma had learned to cook, mend clothes, and keep track of utility bills since she was 9 years old, because she knew her grandfather was getting weaker, even though he always tried to hide it behind his horse jokes. The roof of their house had been leaking for months. Every time the snow melted, water dripped into a bucket placed next to the sofa in the living room. But Walter didn't have enough money to fix it after nearly all his veteran benefits went to medicine and oxygen. Even so, Emma still tried to keep the house as clean as possible. She wiped each old dish until it shone, folded the blankets neatly on the sofa, and placed a few dried pine branches in an old glass vase by the window to make the house feel warmer in the cold winter. Walter often sat by the wood stove telling Emma stories about the friends he had fought with in Vietnam, about the soldiers who had pulled each other out of gunfire in the rainforests, and about those who never had the chance to return home. He always ended those stories with the same saying that no one should be left outside in the winter, because a person truly dies only when no one opens the door for them anymore. Emma didn't fully understand the meaning of that saying, but she always remembered the quiet, sad look in her grandfather's eyes every time he mentioned the men who had died alone. Despite the hardships, Emma had never let herself become bitter. She often left leftover food for the stray dogs behind the town library, even though many nights she herself only had canned soup for dinner. She helped her neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn carried firewood into the house whenever it was cold and always refused money and thanks because Walter taught her that kindness loses its meaning if it's done only to get something in return. The people of Beckley often said Hell's Angels were dangerous people that children should stay out from, especially after a few bar fights near the highway many years ago. But Walter saw them differently. He had met many biker veterans at post-war veteran gatherings and believed many of them were just men carrying too many wounds that the world had never bothered to see. He said there were people who came back from war, but whose souls were still trapped somewhere very far away. Emma always remembered how her grandfather spoke about those bikers with quiet respect, as if behind those leather jackets covered in tattoos were painful stories that outsiders could never understand. On her days off, Emma liked to sit in the old Beckley library reading books about big cities outside West Virginia and quietly dreaming of one day going to college in Charleston. The little girl liked to imagine the large lecture halls, the brightly lit libraries, and a life where no one had to worry about every utility bill each month. But Emma had never told Walter about that dream because she knew he always felt guilty for not being able to give her a better life. There were many nights Walter stayed up very late just to watch Emma fall asleep on the sofa next to her old homework and wonder if he still had enough time to see her grow up. Emma had never complained about their poverty because she understood that her grandfather had sacrificed nearly his entire life to raise her after her mother passed away. In the days before the snowstorm, the radio kept broadcasting warnings that this could be the biggest storm in southern West Virginia in many years. The people of Beckley crowded to buy food and fuel at the only small supermarket still open, while Emma only had enough money to buy a few discounted cans of soup, an old loaf of bread, and some of the cheapest hot chocolate. Walter tried to hide the pain in his chest to help Emma chop more firewood in the front yard before the snow started falling heavier. The grandfather and granddaughter worked in silence in the biting cold, hearing only the sound of the axe-splitting wood and the howling wind echoing from the distant forest. When it was fully dark, Emma took the old blankets from the closet and placed them next to the wood stove, because she knew the house would be very cold if the power went out at night. Walter sat in the old armchair watching the little girl run back and forth in the small room and smiled tiredly. Before Emma went to bed, he called her over and repeated the familiar saying in his hoarse voice from lung disease that no one should be left outside in the winter. Emma nodded as always and pulled the blanket up to her chin amid the increasingly fierce wind outside the window. Around midnight, the snowstorm finally descended on Beckley with a force even more terrible than anything the radio had warned. The wind howled through the Appalachian forests like a ship's horn, echoing from a very distant place, whipping thick layers of snow against the windows of the houses until the whole town shook in the darkness. In less than an hour, the southern West Virginia highway was completely frozen. Dozens of trucks and cars stranded along the winding mountain roads, and the streetlights went out one area at a time, as if Beckley were being swallowed by winter. In that white chaos, 5 Harley-Davidsons still slowly made their way toward the south of town, their weak headlights piercing through the thick snow, barely able to see the road ahead. The group of Hell's Angels bikers was heading to Charleston to join a memorial ride in remembrance of Raymond Doc Keller, a longtime brother in the chapter who had died of lung cancer the previous winter. For Elias Bear Mercer, the tall man leading the biker group, the trip was not simply an annual gathering. Doc had once saved his life in Fallujah many years earlier when both were serving in the Marine Corps, and Bear had promised his old friend that the chapter would always continue the memorial ride every winter, no matter how harsh the weather. Bear had never broken a promise to any of his brothers in his life, and he wasn't going to start tonight. But the Appalachian Mountains didn't care about human promises. As the biker group turned onto the narrow road near Pine Ridge, the front wheel of Lucas's Harley suddenly slipped on an invisible black ice patch covering the road. It all happened too fast. The bike tilted sharply to one side before Lucas was thrown onto the frozen road, his body sliding far across the snow and cold rocks. The sound of metal scraping the road rang out shrilly, then disappeared into the roaring wind. Bear immediately braked hard and turned back, but by the time he and the others reached the spot, Lucas was curled up on the snow, dark blood flowing from his right arm where the leather jacket had been torn open. "Damn it, Lucas. Look at me." Bear knelt in the snow, his large hand holding the younker's shoulder as he shivered from the cold. Lucas tried to smile, but his lips were already blue. "I'm okay. Just cold," he mumbled. But Bear knew he was lying. Two of the motorcycles began to stall from the too low temperatures, and the wind grew so strong that standing firm became difficult. They had no choice but to abandon the bikes and walk to find shelter before Lucas lost too much blood or suffered hypothermia. The snow reached their knees as the five men walked slowly along the road leading back to Beckley. Cell phones had no signal at all. GPS turned into a useless white screen, and the town lights had disappeared behind the dense snow. Lucas began losing feeling in his fingertips, his breathing heavy, and his feet kept slipping on the ice beneath. Bear knew their time was running out. "Keep going," he growled into the wind. "Don't stop." They went deeper into the Maple Hollow area, where small houses stood isolated under rows of snow-covered pine trees. But every time they knocked on a door, all they received was curtains pulled slightly aside, and then immediately closed when those inside saw the five tattooed bikers standing outside in the night. One man even turned off the porch light right in front of them. Bear didn't blame them. With their leather jackets full of Hell's Angels patches and their giant figures in the middle of the storm, they looked more like a nightmare than people seeking help. But Lucas began staggering more with every passing minute, and Bear could hear the young man's teeth chattering in the wind. "Bear," Lucas breathed with difficulty. "I can't feel my arm anymore." It was then that Bear saw a faint light at the end of the road. A small candle flickered behind the frosted window of the house at the end of Maple Hollow. It was the only light left in the entire neighborhood plunged in darkness. Bear looked at his brothers and continued forward. "Last time," he said shortly. "If this house doesn't open, we'll find shelter in an abandoned garage." As they approached the house, the wind was so strong it nearly blew the snow off the porch roof. Bear knocked on the door 3 times hard with his hand already stiff from the cold. Inside, Emma Grace Carter was sitting by the wood stove wrapped in a blanket when she suddenly lifted her head. The knock on the door in the middle of the storm made the little girl's heart pound painfully. Walter was coughing violently in the armchair nearby, but he was too weak to stand up. "Emma," he said hoarsely, "don't open it if it doesn't feel safe." The little girl swallowed hard, grabbed the old flashlight, and slowly walked to the door. The wind outside howled as if it wanted to tear apart the small house. Emma tremblingly unlocked the door and opened it a small crack, and the sight before her left her stunned. 5 giant men stood crowded under the snow-covered porch, their black leather jackets soaked with ice, beards and hair frozen from the cold wind, and dark tattoos visible under the weak flashlight beam. A younger one was clutching his bloody arm tightly, his body leaning heavily to one side as if about to collapse. In that moment, Emma immediately understood they were Hell's Angels bikers, just like what the townspeople always warned about. But she also saw the real desperation in their eyes. Bear slowly took off his gloves, trying to make his voice as gentle as possible, even though his breath had turned into thick white smoke in the freezing air. "Mom," he said hoarsely, "we just need a warm place to shelter for a few hours before dawn. One of our guys is badly hurt." Emma felt fear tighten her chest. These men were so tall they nearly blocked the entire doorway. Just looking at them was enough to make any child want to slam the door shut. But then she remembered Walter, remembered the saying he had repeated for many years that no one should be left outside in the winter. Emma looked at Lucas, shivering from the cold, looked at the blood dripping onto the snow-covered step, and took a deep breath. Finally, the little girl opened the door wider and said in a trembling voice, "Hurry inside before you all freeze to death." As soon as the door closed, the small house was immediately filled with cold air, melting snow, and the giant presence of the 5 men in black leather jackets. The already cramped living room of Emma's house now had almost no space left as the tall bikers stood close together under the weak orange light from the wood stove. The patches of white snow, clinging to their jacket shoulders, beards, hair, and heavy boots, began melting into water on the old wooden floor. Emma stood close to the wall near the kitchen, her hand still gripping the small flashlight tightly, her heart still beating fast from fear. In the flickering light, the tattoos on the bikers' necks and arms looked more intimidating than anything she had ever seen in real life. But then she noticed something strange almost immediately. Those men were trying their best not to scare her. Bear ducked his head low when stepping through the doorway to avoid hitting the ceiling light, and a silver-haired biker behind him gently pulled the door closed with both hands, as if afraid of damaging something in this small house. Take off your boots, Bear said hoarsely to the others. Don't track all that snow inside. He turned to Emma and nodded slightly in apology. Sorry, kid, we made a mess of your floor. Emma was a bit surprised by the way the giant man spoke to her. His voice was deep and hoarse from the cold, but completely without the threatening tone she had imagined about Hell's Angels. One by one, they bent down to remove their heavy boots, caked with snow and ice, right by the front door, before stepping further into the living room. Walter sat in the armchair by the wood stove, an old blanket covering his legs. His eyes, dimmed by age, quietly observing them, as if reading something behind those leather jackets full of patches and tattoos. As a veteran, he recognized the real exhaustion in these men's eyes. Not the aggression of troublemakers, but the weariness of people who had fought the cold and despair for too long. Lucas nearly collapsed beside the old sofa when Emma brought him the first cup of hot water. His two hands shook so badly that the water spilled over the rim. Easy, kid. Bear bent down to hold the cup for Lucas with his large hands. Lucas tried to smile at Emma, but his lips were blue from the cold. Thanks, kid, he said, his voice hoarse from the chill. Emma saw the blood still soaking through the torn jacket on Lucas' arm, and the fear in her gradually gave way to compassion. While she ran to the kitchen to boil more hot water, a large biker named Mason silently walked to the door that had just closed. The wind outside was still howling fiercely, making the old hinges rattle. Without a word, Mason knelt down, used a small multi-tool knife to resecure the loose hinge, and wedged a thin piece of wood under the door to stop the wind from blowing in. His movements were quick and careful, as if he had been fixing doors like this his whole life. Emma stood in the kitchen looking out, a bit surprised to see a man covered in tattoos fiddling with her house door in the middle of the snowstorm. Sorry for touching your stuff without asking, Mason said when he caught the little girl's gaze. If this door flies open, the whole house will freeze tonight. Emma shook her head slightly. It's okay. Bear meanwhile slowly observed the small house around him. He saw the peeling wallpaper near the stairs, the plastic bucket placed under the leaking roof spot, and the old refrigerator that was almost empty except for a few cheap cans of soup. He saw the wool gloves that had been patched many times next to the wood stove, and the too thin jacket Emma was wearing in the freezing winter. A heavy feeling began to appear in his chest. Bear had been through many poor towns in Appalachia, had seen many families living in hardship, but he had never thought a small child like Emma would have to live in conditions like this, and still open the door to save strangers in the middle of a snowstorm. Walter coughed softly, then looked up at Bear. You were in the military? He asked in his hoarse voice. Bear paused slightly at the question, then nodded. Marine Corps, Iraq. Walter smiled very faintly, as if that confirmed what he had guessed from the start. I recognize that look, he said slowly. People who have seen too many things they shouldn't have seen. For a few seconds, the room fell silent except for the crackling of wood in the stove and the howling wind outside the window. Emma brought more blankets for Lucas, then sat down on the small chair near the kitchen, quietly observing the 5 giant bikers trying to make themselves smaller so they wouldn't take up too much space in her tiny room. They still looked scary with the black tattoos covering their arms and their scarred faces under the orange firelight. But the more Emma looked, the more she saw something different from the stories the townspeople always told. These men didn't speak loudly, didn't act rough or scare her. On the contrary, they seemed like people trying their best not to ruin the little bit of peace in this. Emma stood up from the small chair next to the stove and quickly walked over to the old wooden cabinet near the stairs. She pulled open the second drawer and took down a scratched-up metal first aid kit that had almost completely lost its red paint on the outside. It was the first aid kit Walter had kept from his days working as a miner. Inside were all kinds of old bandages, antiseptic, and a few medical tools that had been used over many years. Emma brought the kit over in front of Lucas and knelt down on the floor without hesitation, even though the biker's blood-covered arm looked more terrifying than anything she had ever dealt with before. Lucas leaned back against the sofa, his breathing shaky from the cold and pain. When Emma used scissors to cut away the torn leather jacket around the wound, he clenched his jaw so tightly that the veins stood out on his neck. This might hurt, Emma said softly in a very calm voice, exactly the way Walter always spoke whenever she had to change his bandages. Lucas let out a hoarse laugh. Kiddo, I think there's no way this isn't going to hurt now. Emma opened the old bottle of peroxide and carefully poured it over the torn, raw red flesh on Lucas's arm. He immediately jerked back hard, clenching his jaw so tightly that the sound of his teeth grinding was clear in the small room. A curse slipped out of Lucas's mouth before he could swallow it back, realizing Emma was right in front of him. "Sorry," he breathed heavily. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," Emma replied quietly as she continued to wipe away the blood with an old gauze pad. Walter sat in the armchair next to the fireplace. His breathing labored from the cold, but his eyes still followed every movement of the little girl. "Don't leave the peroxide on too long," he said hoarsely, giving instructions. "Wipe it clean and then wrap the bandage from bottom to top." "Yeah, like that." Emma nodded. Her small hands moved with surprising care for an 11-year-old child. Bear stood quietly near the fireplace, observing the entire scene without saying a word. He had seen army medics work in war zones and had seen many grown adults panic at the sight of blood and injuries, but the little girl in front of him was strangely calm. There were no tears, no fear, just a child focusing on helping someone else as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Bear began to understand that Emma had been taking care of someone for so long that this was no longer unfamiliar to her. While Emma bandaged Lucas's arm, Mason continued walking around the house, checking the gaps where wind was blowing in. He used an old towel to stuff the window frame that was rattling from the wind and brought more firewood to the fireplace. Another biker took off his outer jacket and draped it over the gap in the wall near the stairs where cold air was seeping in. No one said anything, but the whole group began acting as if keeping this small house warm was the most important task they had right now. Emma finally finished wrapping the bandage around Lucas's arm and looked up at the young biker with a questioning look. "Do you still feel numbness in your arm?" Lucas moved his hand slightly and nodded slowly. "It feels better than before. If blood soaks through the bandage, we have to change it right away," Emma said seriously. Lucas chuckled softly, even though his face was still pale. "Yes, Mom." That laugh made the atmosphere in the room feel a little less tense. Emma closed the first aid kit and stood up to go into the kitchen. When she opened the refrigerator, she saw the nearly empty milk carton in the bottom corner. Emma paused for a few seconds. That was the last of the milk the two of them had planned to use for the next few days. But then she glanced over her shoulder at Lucas, who was still shivering next to the sofa, and quietly took the milk carton out. A few minutes later, the smell of hot chocolate began to spread throughout the small room. Emma carried each old porcelain mug out to the group of bikers, with hot steam rising under the orange glow of the fireplace. "Jesus," one silver-haired biker muttered after the first sip. "This is the best thing I've drunk all damn winter." Bear took the mug from Emma with both hands, as if it were the most precious thing he had ever held. "Thank you, kiddo." It was the first time he had called her that, and the others quickly followed suit. "Kiddo, you got any more blankets?" Mason asked while adding more wood to the fire. "Kiddo, sit closer to the fire so you don't get cold." "Kiddo, let me help you carry that." In less than an hour, their attitude had completely changed. They were no longer strangers standing on the porch in the middle of a blizzard, but older men trying to protect the little girl who had saved their lives. Walter watched the scene and smiled tiredly. "Emma has always taken care of me," he said hoarsely to Bear. "Ever since her mother passed. The girl has basically grown up just to take care of others." Bear looked at Emma as she bent down to gather the blood-stained towels and put them into a basin of hot water next to the stove, then at her thin, small shoulders under the old, worn sweater. A heavy feeling appeared in his chest that even he couldn't explain. A child like Emma should have been sleeping peacefully in her warm room, not sit in the middle of a freezing winter night helping injured strangers like this. But what made Bear unable to take his eyes off her was that Emma had not once complained or shown any fear. She just quietly took care of everyone, as if kindness was the only thing she had ever known in her life. After putting the first aid kit back in the old drawer next to the stairs, Emma stood still for a few seconds in the small kitchen, as if calculating something. The wind outside was still howling fiercely, making the window frames rattle violently, while the smell of melting snow, wood smoke, and damp leather mixed in the cramped air of the house. Emma opened the pantry next to the stove and looked inside. There were only a few cans of soup, some white beans, half a pack of old noodles, and a few small potatoes that were starting to sprout. That was almost all the food left for the two of them, until the end of the week after Walter received his veteran benefits. Emma bit her lip lightly but still began taking everything down. and placing it on the kitchen counter. If those men had stayed outside for another hour, one of them might have frozen to death. Emma opened each can of soup and poured everything into the large old pot on the gas stove. She cut the potatoes into small pieces, added water, and the last bit of salt left in the nearly empty spice jar. While she stirred the soup with the old wooden spoon, Bear quietly stood leaning against the kitchen doorframe watching. He saw the nearly empty pantry behind the little girl and immediately understood this was the last of their food. "Kiddo," Bear said slowly, "you don't have to use all your food for us." Emma didn't turn around, just kept stirring the steaming pot of soup. "It's okay," she replied softly. "My grandpa and I still have food." Bear didn't say anything more, but he knew the little girl was lying. The others in the group seemed to begin to understand this as well when Emma placed the hot bowls of soup on the small wooden table in the living room. No one ate right away, even though they were freezing and exhausted after many hours in the blizzard. Lucas looked at the bowl of soup and then at Emma. "Is this your last food?" Emma shook her head too quickly. "No, it's not," but that very haste made the answer sound more like a child's lie. Lucas looked down at the bowl of soup for a few seconds before slowly picking up the spoon. The other bikers also ate very slowly, as if understanding that every spoonful of soup they ate meant one less portion for the little girl sitting across from them. Walter pulled the blanket up to his stomach and smiled faintly as he watched. "It was the same back in the coal mines," he said in a hoarse voice. "There were winters when there was nothing left but potatoes and dry bread. But if the neighbor's house ran out of food, the whole area would share what little they had. That's how people in Appalachia survive." Bear sat by the window, his large hands holding the hot bowl of soup. "Our brotherhood is the same," he said slowly. "No one gets left behind." Walter nodded very slightly, as if he understood that better than anyone else in the room. Lucas took a spoonful of soup and suddenly let out a small laugh. "My mom used to cook like this," he said, his eyes still on the bowl. "White beans and potatoes. Every time it got cold." Emma looked up at him. "Where's your mom now?" Lucas was silent for a few seconds, then shrugged. "Gone a long time ago. Cancer." He smiled faintly. "After that, no one took care of me like family anymore." The whole room fell silent for a few seconds, with only the sound of the wind howling outside the window and the crackling of wood in the fireplace. Then Mason began talking about his wandering days after leaving the military, and another biker mentioned the divorce that caused him to lose custody of his son. Emma sat on the small chair next to the fireplace, holding her bowl of soup with both hands and listening to those giant men tell their stories as if she were listening to distant uncles recounting their lives. She had never thought these heavily tattooed bikers would talk about loss in such a sad voice. Outside, the blizzard was still roaring as if it wanted to crush all of Beckley under a blanket of white ice. But inside the small house at the end of Maple Hollow, around the old wooden table and the simple hot bowls of soup, the feeling of unfamiliarity gradually disappeared. Those giant bikers no longer looked like the scary gang Emma had heard adults talk about. They seemed like tired men trying to find the last bit of human warmth in the freezing winter. After that simple soup meal, the small room gradually settled into a comfortable, peaceful atmosphere that Emma had almost forgotten. The wind outside was still howling through the snow-covered pine trees around Maple Hollow, but inside the house, there was only the crackling of wood in the fireplace and the soft clink of bowls being placed on the table. Walter leaned deeper into the old armchair, his tired eyes quietly observing the group of bikers around the living room. The more he watched, the more he realized these men did not act like the criminals people in town often talked about. Bear kept an eye on everyone in the group, asking Lucas if his arm was still numb, reminding Mason to stay away from the drafty gaps, and giving his own hot chocolate to the youngest biker because the boy was still shivering after hypothermia. Walter had seen this kind of behavior before, many years ago, in military barracks and among soldiers who had lived and died together on the battlefield. This was not how a street gang behaved. This was how men who were used to protecting their brothers acted, almost without thinking. Finally, Walter spoke in a very hoarse voice. "You were in the military, weren't you?" Bear looked up at him for a few seconds, then nodded slightly. "Marine Corps, Iraq." Walter smiled faintly as if he had just confirmed what he had guessed from the beginning. "Vietnam," he replied. "First Cavalry." In that moment, something invisible seemed to change in the room. It was no longer a poor old man talking to the leader of the Hells Angels, but two veterans recognizing each other through their eyes and silence. Bear pulled his chair closer to the fireplace and sat down next to Walter. The two men began talking about war, about friends who never made it home, and the guilt of being alive when others were not. Emma sat curled up on the small chair next to the fireplace, quietly listening to them talk without understanding everything. But she understood enough to realize her grandfather was truly comfortable for the first time in many months. Walter even laughed when Bear told the story of a drunk Marine who burned down an entire tent trying to heat up pizza with a flare gun. It was the first real laugh Emma had heard from her grandfather since last summer. While the two older men talked, Mason sat on the floor near the fireplace and took an old small knife out of his jacket pocket. He bent down to pick up a leftover piece of pine wood and began carefully carving small slices with his large tattooed hands. Emma watched him curiously for a few minutes before realizing Mason was shaping a small wooden bird. "Do you like it?" Mason asked, after handing the small object to the little girl. Emma smiled softly and nodded. "It's really pretty." Walter watched the scene and shook his head as if remembering something distant. "The newspapers only like to talk about the worst parts of biker culture," he said slowly. "They never talk about how many biker veterans saved each other from suicide after the war." The whole room fell silent for a few seconds. Bear looked down at his scarred hands before nodding slightly. "A lot of my brothers don't have anywhere else to belong," he said quietly. Emma looked around the small room at the large men, with tattoos covering their arms and their tired eyes under the orange firelight. She remembered all the scary stories she had heard about the Hells Angels outside town, but now they suddenly felt strangely distant. These men were not monsters. They were people who had been hurt so much by life that they could only rely on each other to keep surviving. Outside, the blizzard continued to intensify, as if all of Appalachia was being submerged under an endless white ocean. The wind slammed fiercely against Walter's old roof, making the entire house shake in terrifying bursts, and the thick layer of snow outside had covered nearly half of the window frames. Then suddenly, the small light bulb in the kitchen flickered a few times before the power in the entire neighborhood went out completely. The house immediately plunged into darkness, with only the weak orange firelight from the fireplace reflecting on the shadowed faces of the biker group. The cold began to seep quickly into every corner of the old house as soon as the heating system stopped working. Walter pulled the blanket tighter around himself, but just a few minutes later the familiar cough suddenly hit him harder than ever. At first it was just a few hoarse coughs, but then he doubled over in the armchair, his hand clutching his chest as his breathing became labored. Emma immediately jumped up. "Grandpa?" The little girl cried out in panic as she ran over. Walter tried to respond but could only make painful wheezing sounds. His face quickly turned pale under the fireplace light. "I can't breathe." Emma heard herself almost starting to cry. Bear immediately stood up as if by reflex, like a soldier responding to an alarm. "Everyone stay calm," he said firmly, then knelt down beside Walter. "Lucas, help him sit up straighter. Mason, add wood to the fire right now." A silver-haired biker named Dean quickly opened the emergency kit he carried and knelt beside Walter. "I used to be a medic," he said briefly before checking the old man's breathing. Walter was still coughing violently. Every breath felt like knives cutting through his chest. Emma stood next to the armchair, her hands shaking with fear so badly she could barely hold the warm towel she was carrying. Dean took an emergency inhaler from his bag and looked at Walter. "Listen to me, old man. Try to breathe slowly." Bear held Walter's shoulders firmly while Dean helped him use the medicine. The whole room fell into tense silence, with only the sound of the wind howling outside and Walter struggling to take each difficult breath. Emma felt as if her heart was being squeezed. In her mind, there was only one terrifying thought. If this group of bikers hadn't been here tonight, she might have had to watch her grandfather die right in front of her without being able to do anything. After what felt like endless minutes, Walter's breathing finally began to stabilize. He leaned his head back against the chair, his eyes closed from exhaustion, but at least he was no longer gasping like before. Emma almost cried with relief. Bear looked at the little girl and lowered his voice. "Your grandpa will be okay, kiddo." Dean pulled the blanket up tighter around Walter and turned to Bear. "He needs to stay warm constantly. If the temperature in the house drops any more, it will be very dangerous." Bear immediately stood up. "All right, let's divide up the work." For the many hours that followed, The group of bikers practically turned the small house into a real winter shelter. Mason and Lucas took turns reinforcing the windows with old boards they found in the garage behind the house. Dean continuously checked Walter's breathing, while another biker climbed onto the porch roof in the middle of the blizzard to temporarily cover the leak with a tarp from the broken Harley. Bear hardly sat down for a minute. He kept walking around the house, checking every draft, adding wood to the fireplace, and making sure Emma was always near the warmest spot in the room. The storm outside grew increasingly fierce, with the wind sounding like the howl of wild animals around the small house. But inside, thanks to those stranger men, the warmth was preserved bit by bit. Around 3 in the morning, Emma finally began to run out of strength. She sat close to Walter's armchair, one hand still holding her grandfather's wrinkled hand, as if afraid he would disappear if she let go. Bear stood near the fireplace, watching the little girl fight sleep for a few more minutes until her small eyes finally closed. Emma dozed off on the edge of the chair, her head resting on Walter's arm in the dim orange firelight. Bear quietly walked over and gently pulled the blanket up over her shoulders. He stood looking at Emma for a long few seconds. In all his years riding with the chapter, Bear had met all kinds of people on the road, but he had never seen a child so small try so hard to be strong for others. A strange feeling began to grow in his chest, like a protective instinct he thought he had lost a long time ago. Outside, the blizzard finally reached its most intense peak, with the wind wildly whipping the house as if it wanted to crush it in the Appalachian night. But inside the small house at the end of Maple Hollow, around the fireplace light and the strangers quietly taking care of each other, a rare feeling of safety began to appear. Around 4 in the morning, the storm outside finally slowed down a bit, though the wind still howled long around the snow-covered pine trees behind the house. Inside the small living room, the firelight from the fireplace cast soft orange patches on the old wooden walls and on the tattoo-covered arms of the bikers sitting around the room. Walter had fallen asleep after the breathing attack, his breathing now steadier under the thick blanket, while Emma sat curled up on the rug next to the fireplace, her eyes still full of fear from what had just happened. But the long silence brought back the childlike curiosity in her. Emma stared at Mason's tattoo-covered arm for a long time before finally asking softly, "Those tattoos, what do they mean?" Mason looked down at his arm and chuckled softly. "More than you think, kiddo." He pulled his sleeve up a little more under the firelight. The old tattoos became clearer: skulls, military numbers, and a few small names written in black ink that had faded over the years. Mason touched a tattoo of silver wings near his wrist with his finger. "This one is Tommy," he said slowly. "Marine. Died in Fallujah." Then he pointed to another name near his elbow. "And this is Rick. Motorcycle accident in Colorado." Emma listened quietly as Mason explained that almost every tattoo on them was the name or symbol of a brother who had been lost, either on the road or in the military. "We carry them with us," Mason said quietly, "so they won't be forgotten." Emma had never thought those scary tattoos were filled with so many memories. Lucas, who was now leaning back against the sofa with his bandaged arm resting on his thigh, took an old small photo out of his leather jacket pocket and handed it to Emma. In the photo was a little girl about 5 years old with blonde hair and a smile very much like Lucas's. "My daughter," he said softly. "Her name is Lily." Emma smiled as she looked at the photo. "She's so pretty." Lucas smiled, but the smile quickly disappeared. "While walking out in the storm, I really thought I was going to freeze to death out there." He looked down at his hand for a few seconds before continuing in a quieter voice. "The only thing I could think about was that I would never see her again." The whole room fell silent again. Bear sat near the window, his eyes looking out at the white snow outside as if gazing somewhere very far away. After a few seconds, he spoke slowly. "The person we're riding to memorialize is Doc Keller." Emma turned to look at him. "Was he your best friend?" Bear nodded very slightly. "Since Iraq." He smiled faintly. "Doc once saved my life from an IED. After the war, he was the one who kept this whole chapter from falling apart." Bear paused for a few seconds before continuing. "Lung cancer took him last winter." Walter slowly opened his eyes at this point and looked around the room. He quietly observed each face under the firelight and realized they all carried the same kind of pain he had seen in old veterans many years before. These men didn't just wear tattoos on their skin. They carried losses that life had never healed. Emma began to see them differently from when she first opened the door. They were no longer the giant, scary bikers stepping out of the snowy night. They were like strange uncles trying to hide their sadness with leather jackets and loud laughs. Then a younger biker sitting near the kitchen unexpectedly spoke for the first time in many hours. "My little brother died of an overdose 3 years ago," he said so softly it was barely loud enough for the room to hear. "I found him in the bathroom." His voice broke on the last words. The large man lowered his head, his shoulders shaking slightly before he suddenly began to cry, as if he finally no longer had the strength to hold everything inside. Emma felt her chest tighten when she heard overdose. The image of her mother lying motionless on the old sofa many years ago suddenly appeared in her mind, leaving her stunned. Bear just slowly placed his hand on the young biker's shoulder without saying anything, and strangely, that very silence made the room feel warmer. Outside, the snow still covered all of Beckley in the freezing night, but inside the small house at the end of Maple Hollow, those seemingly stranger people had finally found a place safe enough to tell their most painful stories without fear of judgment. Around 6 o'clock in the morning, the last of the darkness finally began to fade behind the rows of snow-covered pine trees surrounding Maple Hollow. The storm was no longer howling fiercely like it had all night. Only cold gusts of wind blew across the thick layer of snow, blanketing the road leading into Beckley. The pale gray light of dawn slipped through the frosted windows, reflecting into the living room where the group of bikers slept, slumped in various positions around the nearly burned-out fireplace. Lucas rested his head on the sofa with his arms still fully bandaged. Mason slept on the floor next to the pile of firewood, and Bear sat leaning against the wall near the window, his eyes half closed like a man who had never truly allowed himself to sleep deeply. Emma was the first to wake up. The little girl gently pulled the blanket off her shoulders and looked around the quiet house. Walter was still asleep in the armchair, his breathing slow but much steadier than the night before. Emma breathed a sigh of relief before quietly stepping into the kitchen. When she opened the pantry, she saw a small bag of flour still left at the bottom of the shelf. It was just enough for one last batch of biscuits. Emma stood still for a few seconds, then took it down anyway. She mixed the flour with the remaining milk, added a bit of old baking powder, and began kneading small portions with her freezing cold hands. Before long, the smell of hot biscuits began to spread throughout the house, blending with the aroma of black coffee boiling on the old gas stove. Mason was the first to wake up because of the smell of food. He slowly opened his eyes and then chuckled softly when he saw Emma standing by the stove in an oversized old apron. "Kiddo, you really know how to save people's lives," he muttered in a hoarse voice. The others gradually woke up one by one. Lucas sat up slowly, still grimacing from the pain in his arm, while Bear walked over to the window to look out at the blanket of white snow outside before turning back to the small, warm room. Emma placed the hot biscuits on the old wooden table and poured coffee into the chipped ceramic mugs. No one said anything for the first few seconds as they started eating. There was only the sound of slow chewing and hot steam rising in the dim light of the winter morning. Lucas finally let out a soft laugh and shook his head. "This is the best meal I've had in years." Emma blushed a little at the compliment, while Walter had now woken up too, his old eyes looking around the room with a rare sense of peace. Outside, Beckley was still buried under white negunsu and completely without power. But inside the small house at the end of Maple Hollow, everyone sat around the table like a family that had just survived something together. After breakfast, Bear slowly stood up and took a thick wad of cash wrapped in a waterproof bag from his leather jacket pocket. He walked over to Walter and placed it on the table. "For fixing the roof," Bear said shortly, "and for buying food." Emma's eyes widened when she saw the amount of money, more than she had ever seen in her life. But Walter almost immediately pushed it back. "No," Bear frowned slightly. "You saved our lives." Walter shook his head slowly and pulled the blanket tighter around himself. "I didn't open the door to get paid." Bear looked at the old man for a few seconds, as if unaccustomed to being refused like that. "You need this money." "Maybe," Walter replied in a hoarse but firm voice. "But kindness isn't something to be bought and sold with cash." The whole room fell silent after that statement. Bear slowly glanced over at Emma, who was standing by the stove with her hands still dusted in white flour. He looked at the old house, the nearly empty pantry, and the repeatedly patched blankets around the fireplace. This family had almost nothing, yet they still shared their last bit of food and opened their door to save strangers in the middle of a blizzard without expecting anything in return. When the sun finally began to rise weakly behind the gray clouds covering Appalachia, the group of bikers knew it was time for them to leave, before the snow froze even harder on the mountain roads. But instead of immediately preparing their bikes and hitting the road, all 5 men quietly set to work around Emma's small house, as if it were the most natural thing to do. Mason and Lucas used shovels to clear the thick layer of snow from the front porch and the path leading to the main road so Walter could go out if needed. Another biker fixed the wooden fence that had been knocked crooked by the wind all night, while Dean checked the makeshift cover on the porch roof one last time to make sure it wouldn't collapse in the next cold snap. Bear barely sat down for a minute. He walked around the backyard, reinforcing the old garage door and stuffing more wood into the gaps under the house where cold air still seeped in. Emma stood on the porch, watching them work against the pure white snow with a strange feeling in her heart. Just last night, she had thought these men were terrifying bikers straight out of a winter nightmare. Yet now they were quietly fixing every little thing in her house, like longtime family. Mason eventually found Walter's old axe in the garage and started chopping firewood behind the house. The sounds of the axe striking the logs echoed steadily in the freezing air of the Appalachian morning. He worked continuously for nearly an hour until a large pile of firewood was stacked under the back porch cover. It was enough not just for a few days, but almost for the entire cold week ahead. Mason planted the axe in the ground and breathed out a puff of white vapor. "This way, you two won't freeze to death," he said in a half-joking, half-serious tone. Walter stood leaning against the door looking at the new pile of firewood, his old eyes shining with something like emotion that he tried to hide behind a calm expression. In his many difficult years living in Beckley, he had grown used to handling everything alone. It had been a very long time since anyone had helped him without demanding something in return. Lucas, meanwhile, walked slowly up to Emma. His arm was still bandaged, but the color in his face was much better than the night before. For a few seconds, Lucas just stood looking at the little girl without saying anything, as if he didn't know how to express what he wanted to say. Then suddenly, he bent down and hugged Emma very gently. "You saved my life last night," Lucas said in a hoarse voice close to her ear. "If you hadn't opened the door, I would never have seen my daughter again." Emma stood still in the awkward arms of the big man and hugged him back lightly. "Drive carefully, okay?" the little girl said softly. Lucas let out a choked laugh at her words and nodded. Bear then walked over to Emma. He was silent for a few seconds before taking an old silver challenge coin from his leather jacket pocket. One side featured the Marine Corps emblem, the other engraved with the word Semper Fidelis worn by time. Bear placed the coin in the palm of Emma's small hand and closed her fingers around it. "Keep it safe, kiddo," he said slowly. "Marines only give challenge coins to people they truly respect." Emma looked at the coin gleaming in the cold light of the winter morning, and then looked up at Bear. "Are you sure?" Bear nodded very slightly. More than anything, in that moment, Emma suddenly felt her throat tighten even though she didn't quite understand why. Maybe because she knew these men were about to leave, and maybe because, after one long terrifying night, her small house felt more like a family than it had at any time since her mother passed away. Finally, when the Harleys were upright again and started up in the thick snow, the entire front yard filled with the deep rumble of engines echoing down the snow-covered Maple Hollow Road. Emma pulled her old sweater tighter and stood on the porch next to Walter, watching the group of bikers prepare to leave. Lucas raised his hand to wave at the little girl one last time. Mason winked playfully before putting on his helmet, and Bear stopped his bike for a long few seconds, as if wanting to say something, but finally just nodded slowly. Then all 5 Harleys began rolling through the white snow, gradually disappearing into the cold mist and snow-covered pine rows of Appalachia. Emma stood still watching until the last sound of the engines faded completely into the winter air. A strange empty feeling appeared in her chest, as if something important had just left the small house. "We'll never see them again, right?" Emma asked softly. Walter stood beside her, the blanket draped over his shoulders, his eyes still looking toward the white road in the distance. He was silent for a few seconds, then smiled gently. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "the shortest encounters are the ones that change a person's life forever." The days after the blizzard passed slowly under Beckley's cold gray sky, but the small house at the end of Maple Hollow no longer felt exactly the same. Even though the bikers had left nearly a week ago, Emma still unconsciously looked out at the snow-covered road every time she heard an engine sound from afar, as if part of her still hoped to see those black Harleys appear again through the winter mist. Walter was a little stronger after the storm night, perhaps thanks to being kept warm for so many hours, and perhaps because, for the first time in a very long time, he felt he was no longer completely alone in this world. But then strange things began to happen around their small house. First, a food delivery truck stopped in front of the porch on Monday morning. The driver simply handed Emma 3 boxes full of canned food, bread, milk, frozen meat, and even cough medicine for Walter before saying everything had been paid for, and immediately drove away. "Who sent this?" Emma ran after him to ask, but the man just shrugged. "No name." 2 days later, something strange happened again when Walter went to the only pharmacy still open in Beckley to buy medicine for his lungs. The old pharmacist behind the counter checked the computer for a few seconds, then looked up with a puzzled expression. "Your medicine has already been paid for the next 6 months." Walter frowned. "Is there a mistake?" The pharmacist shook his head. "No mistake. Someone called this morning." Walter returned home with the bag of medicine in hand and a thoughtful look on his face all afternoon. Emma looked at her grandfather for a long time before finally speaking up. "Do you think it's them?" Walter didn't answer right away, but both of them knew who they meant. 3 days after that, a white pickup truck with a construction company logo unexpectedly stopped in front of the house. 2 men in work jacket got out and said they had been hired to inspect the storm-damaged roof for free. Emma and Walter looked at each other in confusion as the workers climbed onto the roof to check every leak and measure carefully. "Who hired you?" Walter asked. The older man just looked down at the paper on his clipboard and replied, "A community support fund. What's the name?" Not specified. But when one worker left the paper on the kitchen table for a few minutes, Walter accidentally saw a small logo printed in the bottom corner, a pair of silver wings surrounding a stylized eagle. He froze immediately because he had seen that emblem before. It was almost identical to the small patch on Bear's leather jacket that night. Walter said nothing, just quietly folded the paper and put it back. That evening, Emma sat by the fireplace with the challenge coin in her hand. She had started the habit of taking it out to look at every night before bed. Every time her small fingers touched the cold metal with the words, Semper Fidelis, worn by the years, Emma remembered the men who had taken shelter in her house during the blizzard. She remembered Mason's hoarse laugh, the way Lucas hugged the photo of his daughter, as if afraid of losing the last important thing he had, and Bear's quiet gaze as he looked out at the white snow beyond the window. What Emma couldn't understand was why those people continued to help the two of them, even though they had left long ago. Walter had tried many times to pretend it was all just coincidence, but even he no longer truly believed that. Then the town of Beckley began talking about the black SUV that frequently appeared near the Maple Hollow area every late afternoon. Neighbor Mrs. Evelyn said she had seen it parked under the road leading into the woods near Emma's house for nearly an hour before quietly leaving. Someone else claimed the car had Illinois plates, not West Virginia. Emma once ran out to the porch when she heard an unfamiliar engine sound on the road, but the SUV had already left before she could clearly see who was inside. Still, she had the feeling that someone was quietly watching to make sure the two of them were okay. One evening, while Emma was putting the newly delivered food into the pantry that was almost full again for the first time in months, she finally turned to Walter. "Why are they still helping us?" Walter sat in the armchair by the fireplace, his old eyes watching the dancing flames for a few seconds before shaking his head gently. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "because sometimes being saved from the darkness by others makes a person unable to forget." But even Walter didn't know that all those strange things were only the beginning. One cold gray afternoon nearly 2 weeks after the blizzard, while Emma was helping Walter restart the fireplace, the sound of a car engine echoed from the end of Maple Hollow, making both of them look up. At first, Emma thought it was just another delivery truck like the previous days, but the sound grew louder and didn't resemble any of the old pickups in Beckley. The little girl stepped out onto the porch and nearly froze when she saw 3 shiny black SUVs slowly moving down the snow-covered road toward their small house. The vehicles looked completely out of place in the old poor neighborhood, with its rotting wooden fences and roofs covered in white ice. Within minutes, curtains in the surrounding houses began to part one by one. Mrs. Evelyn across the street even stepped fully out into her yard with a stunned expression. People in Maple Hollow had never seen any luxury convoy appear here, let alone 3 black SUVs that looked like government or billionaire cars on TV. The first SUV stopped in front of Emma's house, and the rear door slowly opened. A tall man stepped out in an expensive, perfectly fitted black suit, a long dark gray cashmere overcoat reaching his knees, and shiny leather shoes that barely had any snow on them. For the first few seconds, Emma didn't recognize who he was at all. This man looked more like the CEO of a major corporation than the biker who had slept on her floor during the blizzard. But then he lifted his head and Emma recognized those eyes. "Bear?" the little girl almost blurted out. The giant man smiled very slightly. "Hey, kiddo." Walter slowly stepped out onto the porch behind Emma and also stood stunned. Not only because of Bear's completely different appearance, but also because of how the other men in suits around him acted. They kept their distance, constantly scanning the surroundings like professional security. Another man stepped forward to hold an umbrella for Bear, even though the snow was only falling lightly. The whole scene looked like something from a completely different world than Maple Hollow. Bear walked up the old wooden steps and removed his leather gloves. "I think I should reintroduce myself properly," he said in a calm voice. He extended his hand toward Walter. "Elias Mercer." Walter shook his hand slowly. "Walter Carter?" Bear nodded slightly and continued. "I'm the founder of Mercer Freight and Logistics." Emma blinked in confusion. The name sounded strangely familiar. Walter also frowned for a few seconds as if trying to recall something. Then suddenly he froze. "Mercer Freight?" he repeated slowly. "The trucking company in Chicago?" Bear nodded. "One of them." Walter looked at him for a few more seconds, then turned to Emma with an almost disbelieving expression. Even Emma was beginning to recognize the name. Mercer Freight and Logistics was the trucking company she had seen many times on the highway near Beckley, a giant logistics corporation that appeared on TV and in the newspapers. Walter finally let out an incredulous laugh. "Good Lord," he muttered. "You really are Elias Mercer?" Bear shrugged slightly as if it wasn't that important. But for Emma and Walter it was. The man who had once sat by their fireplace with snow-covered boots and Lucas's blood on his arm turned out to be one of the most powerful businessmen in the Midwest. Emma looked at the expensive suit, the black SUVs, and the security team standing a few meters away, then remembered the man in the old leather jacket eating soup in their small kitchen a few weeks earlier. The contrast was so strange that the little girl didn't know how to react. Bear saw the stunned looks on the grandfather and granddaughter's faces and chuckled softly. "That night I wasn't any CEO," he said slowly. "Just a man about to freeze to death on the road." That statement eased the atmosphere a bit. Emma was still standing there stunned when she suddenly noticed something in the kitchen behind Bear. An old business magazine was propped under the leg of the table to keep it from wobbling. On the cover was a photo of a man in a suit standing in front of a row of giant trucks with the headline about the billion-dollar freight king of the Midwest. Emma's eyes widened and she suddenly burst out laughing. "Grandpa?" The little girl laughed as she ran into the kitchen and pulled out the magazine. "Been using his face to prop up the table for years." Bear bent down to look at the cover and then laughed out loud for the first time since arriving. Walter couldn't help laughing along, and Emma laughed so hard she had to hold her stomach. In those short few minutes, the gap between biker and billionaire, between poor Maple Hollow and the world of expensive black SUVs, suddenly vanished completely in the genuine laughter ringing through the small house at the end of the snowy road. The laughter still echoed lightly in the small kitchen after the story about the magazine propping up the table, as Bear slowly sat down on the old wooden chair next to Walter. Outside on the porch, the men in suits and the security team still stood beside the row of black SUVs against the white snow. But inside the small house, the atmosphere was once again just like the blizzard night a few weeks earlier. Only warmth, the smell of coffee, and people talking like family. Bear placed his leather gloves on the table and looked around the house one more time. He saw the cracks in the wooden walls, the roof still stained with water despite the temporary repairs, and the old fireplace crackling weakly. Then he looked at Emma holding the challenge coin in her hand, as if afraid it would disappear if she let go. "I didn't come here to pay for your kindness," Bear finally spoke in a slow voice. "I came because there are people who deserve to be seen." Walter frowned slightly as if he didn't fully understand. Bear continued. That night, your family opened the door for 5 strangers when there was almost nothing left in the house except a few cans of soup and the last bit of firewood. Many people 10 times richer than me might not have done that. The whole room fell silent. Emma sat close to Walter, her blue eyes wide as she looked at the giant man in the expensive suit in front of her. Bear took a thin folder from the leather briefcase by his feet and placed it on the table. "The Mercer Foundation will completely renovate this entire house," he said directly. "New roof, new heating system, insulation, plumbing, and electricity, everything." Walter immediately shook his head almost by reflex. "No, that's two." "That's not all," Bear interrupted, but his voice remained calm. "All of your medical expenses will be covered by the Foundation for Life." Walter was stunned. Emma turned to look at her grandfather, then back at Bear, as if unsure she had heard correctly. Bear opened another set of papers. "And Emma?" He looked straight at the little girl. "You will have your own college fund until you reach adulthood. If you want to study in Charleston, Pittsburgh, or anywhere, money will no longer be an obstacle for you." Emma felt her throat tighten. The little girl had never heard anyone talk to her about the future as if it truly existed. For many years, college had only been a distant dream she quietly kept in her mind every time she read books at the Beckley library. But now the man who had once sat by her fireplace was talking about it as something completely possible. Bear leaned back in his chair and looked at Walter. "I've also bought the old community center near the Beckley train station." Walter frowned in surprise. That building had been abandoned for nearly 10 years since the town declined. "We will rebuild it into a winter shelter and free soup kitchen," Bear continued. "A place for the elderly, veterans, and poor families to take shelter in the winter." He paused for a few seconds, then smiled very slightly. "And I want you to be the honorary advisor for the Veterans Outreach Program there." Walter looked at him as if he had just heard something too far from reality. An old, sick former miner like him had never thought anyone would value his opinion that much. "Why?" he finally asked softly. Bear was silent for a few seconds before answering. "Because you've kept your kindness after everything life has taken from you." The room fell silent again. Outside the window, snow was still falling lightly on Maple Hollow, and Emma felt her heart beating so hard it hurt. Bear looked at the little girl and spoke even more slowly. "That blizzard night reminded me why people need to protect each other." He smiled faintly. "For many years, I only knew how to work, expand the company, make more money, and think that was enough. But then a child who had almost nothing still opened the door to save strangers from freezing to death." Walter took a deep breath and shook his head with difficulty. "I don't want to become a charity case." "This isn't charity," Bear replied immediately. "This is investing in good people." Walter remained silent, the pride of an old Appalachian man clear in his eyes. All his life he had taken care of himself and Emma. Even when they were so poor they had to patch and repatch every old shirt. Accepting such great help made him feel like he was failing. But then Emma suddenly took hold of her grandfather's wrinkled hand. "Grandpa," the little girl said softly. Walter turned to look at her. Emma squeezed his hand gently. "Sometimes accepting help is also a form of courage." That statement left Walter speechless. Bear also bowed his head slightly, as if he had just heard something very important. He looked around the house and continued in a lower voice. "I won't erase your family's memories." He pointed to the old photos on the wall and the fireplace that had burned throughout that blizzard night. "We're not building a mansion or turning this place into something unfamiliar. I just want to help keep this home continuing to exist." Emma looked down at the challenge coin in her hand, a warm feeling beginning to rise in her eyes. Bear looked at her for a long time, before slowly saying the final thing. "Kiddo, you deserve a better childhood than what life has given you." That very statement finally made Emma burst into tears. Not the panicked or painful kind like the night her mother passed away, but the emotion that had been held back for too long in a child who always had to be stronger than her real age. Bear sat quietly, letting the little girl cry, while Walter pulled Emma closer to him in the warm light of the small house at the end of Maple Hollow, where one blizzard night had changed all their lives forever. The small house at the end of Maple Hollow fell into silence after Emma burst into tears in Walter's arms. No one in the room tried to break that moment. Even the men in suits standing outside on the porch quietly turned their faces away, as if understanding that some emotions should not be interrupted. Bear sat quietly beside the old wooden table, his large hands clasped in front of him, His gaze lowered following the dancing flames in the fireplace. A long while later, he finally spoke slowly. Lucas would have died that night. Emma lifted her head to look at him through eyes, still red from crying. Bear looked toward the frosted window, as if he could still see the blizzard raging outside. Blood loss, hypothermia, another hour out there and his heart would have stopped. He paused for a few seconds, then turned to Emma. If you hadn't opened the door, we would have lost a brother. The whole room was silent. Emma remembered the image of Lucas standing shivering on the porch in the wind and snow, blood soaking his arm under the weak flashlight beam. At the time, she had only thought that if she closed the door, those men would freeze to death outside. She had never thought her decision would actually save someone's life. Bear leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly, full of exhaustion. Do you know what the strangest thing is, kiddo? Emma shook her head slightly. For many years, all of us had almost stopped believing in people. Walter quietly watched him as Bear continued in a low voice. We've seen too much war, betrayal, people leaving, people dying. There were times we thought this world only had people looking out for themselves. He looked down at his scarred hands. Then a poor child living in a house with almost nothing opened the door for 5 strangers in the middle of a blizzard. Bear let out a small laugh, but his eyes were full of sadness. You made us remember that real kindness still exists in this world. Emma looked down at the challenge coin in her hand, not knowing what to say. She had never thought a simple act like opening the door to help others could change so much. A silence stretched for a few seconds before Bear spoke again, this time his voice much softer. I once had a daughter your age. Emma immediately lifted her head. This was the first time she had heard Bear mention his family. Even Walter paused slightly. Bear stared into the fire in the fireplace for a long time before continuing. Her name was Claire. A very faint smile passed over his lips, then disappeared almost immediately. She loved drawing horses and always made me read the same storybook every night. He took a deep breath. Claire died in a car accident with her mother 12 years ago. No one spoke. Emma felt her chest tighten when she saw the look in Bear's eyes as he mentioned his daughter. It was the look of a man who had lived too long with loss and had never truly gotten past it. After the funeral, Bear continued slowly. I almost only had the chapter left as family. He smiled faintly. And then that blizzard night, when you opened the door and looked at us, I saw Claire's eyes again. Emma didn't know why those words made her tears want to spill out again. Maybe because for the first time she understood that these men also felt pain and loneliness in a way very similar to her own. Walter sat quietly for a long time before finally speaking softly. The girl didn't know that. He looked at Emma with gentle eyes mixed with pride. She only always tried to help others. Bear nodded slowly. That's exactly why she was able to do what many adults couldn't. Walter looked around the small house, at the giant men in expensive suits whose eyes still carried the exhaustion of the bikers from that blizzard night. And for the first time, he truly understood that Emma had not only saved their lives. The little girl had unintentionally healed a part of people who seemed no longer capable of believing in anything good. Bear finally stood up and walked over to stand in front of Emma. He bent down low enough to look her in the eyes. Listen to me, kiddo, he said in a firm voice. Biker Brotherhood never forgets a debt to its family. Emma instinctively started to shake her head because she had never thought anyone owed her anything. But Bear only smiled slightly. Not because you saved our lives, he continued, but because you reminded us of who we used to be before life made everything too cold. Outside the window, snow was still falling lightly on Maple Hollow, but for the first time in many years, Emma's small house no longer felt lonely in the Appalachian winter. In the months that followed, Beckley began to change in a way no one in town ever thought they would see in their lifetime. At first, it was just a few construction trucks with the Mercer Foundation logo appearing near Maple Hollow. But then the work gradually spread throughout the old neighborhood at the foot of the Appalachians. The people of Beckley, used to empty promises from politicians and big companies, didn't really believe anything would happen at first. But as the days passed, people began to see the changes with their own eyes. Emma and Walter's house was the first to be renovated. The crew replaced the entire old roof that had leaked for years, installed a new heating system, and reinforced all the wooden walls that had rotted from the harsh Appalachian winters. But at Walter's request, they kept the old wooden porch that he had built with his own hands when Emma was very young. That's the only part of this house, That still reminds me I was once strong enough to build it," Walter said to Bear one afternoon while watching the workers, and Bear just nodded and told everyone to keep every wooden plank on the front porch. Emma often stood in the yard watching the house change day by day with a feeling that was both strange and emotional. She had never thought there would come a day when the small house at the end of Maple Hollow would have new windows, insulated walls, and warm, bright lights every evening without worrying about next month's electricity bill. But what truly shocked all of Beckley was the old community center near the train station. The abandoned building that had been full of broken glass, graffiti, and groups of addicts gathering every evening was suddenly bought by the Mercer Foundation and completely renovated. In just a few months, it turned into a modern winter shelter with clean beds, heated rooms, bathrooms, and a free soup kitchen operating every day for the poor, veterans, and anyone needing a hot meal in winter. Walter began going there every week to serve as advisor for the Veterans Outreach Program, just as Bear had promised. For the first time in many years, he felt he was still useful to someone. The strangest thing for the people of Beckley was that the Hells Angels bikers began appearing around town more often than the construction workers. But this time they didn't come to bars or cause trouble, like in the old stories people still told. Mason and Lucas almost every weekend rode their Harleys back to Maple Hollow to fix porch roofs for neighbors, chop firewood for the elderly, or help rebuild fences damaged by the storm. Once Emma even saw Dean kneeling down to fix a bicycle for Mrs. Evelyn's boy right in the front yard, while still wearing his patched leather cut. At first, many people in town were still wary of them. Some mothers pulled their children inside when they heard Harleys coming from the end of the street. But gradually, after seeing with their own eyes those big bikers handing out free food, fixing houses for the elderly, and delivering medicine to sick veterans, Beckley's view began to change. Walter had once said the media only told the worst part of biker culture, and now the whole town finally began to understand what that meant. The men who had once been considered the most frightening were quietly doing more good than the rich and powerful people who had promised to save Beckley for decades. Walter also changed. With proper medicine and better treatment, he began to get stronger little by little. The cough was still there, but no longer left him nearly suffocating every night. There were mornings when Emma saw him walk out to the porch by himself to drink coffee in the cold, without needing an oxygen tank beside him for the first time in many years. The biggest change wasn't his health, but Walter's eyes. He began to have real hope again, something Emma thought he had lost long ago since the day her mother passed away. And Emma almost became the little girl loved by all of Beckley. The story of the blizzard night spread throughout town faster than anyone imagined. People talked about the little girl living in the house at the end of Maple Hollow who had opened the door to save 5 bikers from freezing to death in the historic storm. The old ladies at church began bringing pies to Emma every weekend, and teachers at school often hugged her a little longer whenever they met her in the hallway. But what made Emma laugh the most was that the kids in the neighborhood were no longer afraid of the sound of Harleys. They started calling the biker group Snow Angels. The name appeared after a boy saw Mason handing out free winter jackets in front of the community center and yelled that those snow bikers look more like angels. And that strange name just spread throughout Beckley. In the spring, the Mercer Foundation even built a new playground on the abandoned lot near Emma's house, a place that had been full of weeds and old trash for over 10 years. Now every afternoon it echoed with the sound of children laughing and playing under the brightly painted red and blue swings. Emma often sat on the bench next to Walter, watching the kids run and jump in the pale golden sunset light over the small Appalachian town. Some days Lucas and Mason would stop by on their Harleys and get surrounded by the kids begging to sit on the bikes. And the strangest thing was that Beckley finally began to feel like a real community again. After years of decline, job loss, and despair, people started knowing their neighbors' names again, gathering in the soup kitchen to talk every evening, and believing again that maybe this small town wasn't completely dead like everyone once thought. It all started from one door being opened in the middle of the coldest blizzard night of the year. Spring gradually arrived in Beckley after the harshest winter in many years, and with it came something Emma never thought she would have again. The feeling that the small house at the end of Maple Hollow was truly alive again. The Harleys had now become a familiar sight on the sunlit afternoon road in front of her house. Almost every week, one or two bikers would stop by as if this place had long been a regular stop in their lives. Some days Mason came just to help Walter fix the old armchair on the porch, and then stayed for dinner. Some days Dean brought new medicine for Walter, and played dominoes with the old man until late at night. There were also afternoons when Bear showed up unexpectedly, in the familiar black SUV, just to sit and drink coffee on the porch with Emma after school. No one felt they were guests anymore. They were like strange but reliable uncles that life had finally sent to Emma after so many years of loss. One afternoon in early April, Lucas returned to Beckley, but this time behind his Harley was not another biker but a 6-year-old blonde girl, hugging her father's waist tightly with her tiny arms. When Lucas took off her helmet, Emma immediately recognized the girl as the child in the old photo Lucas had once shown her on the blizzard night. "Kiddo," Lucas smiled lightly. "This is Lily." The little girl hid halfway behind her father for a few seconds, then waved shyly at Emma. Lucas bent down and placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Daddy told you already, right?" Lily nodded very slightly, before running over to hug Emma so suddenly that the girl almost lost her balance. "Thank you for saving my dad," Lily whispered. In that moment, Emma felt her eyes sting without knowing why. Lucas stood watching the two girls, then turned his face away for a few seconds as if to hide his own emotions. Mason, meanwhile, had almost turned Walter's backyard into his own strange classroom with Emma. He taught the little girl how to fix bicycle chains, change tires, and even how to chop firewood with the right stance so she wouldn't hurt her back. "If you hold the axe like that, the handle will hit you in the face," Mason grumbled, while Emma laughed at how overly serious he looked. Walter often sat on the porch, watching the scene with a cup of coffee in hand and a tired but peaceful smile. There were days when the whole backyard rang with laughter when Emma dropped a piece of firewood, or when Lucas pretended to panic every time Lily climbed onto his Harley. Walter had once thought that after his daughter's death, this house would forever only have the sound of his cough and long silence through every winter. But now, almost every day, there was the sound of people talking, the sound of Harleys echoing in the yard, or Emma's laughter ringing through the pine trees at the end of Maple Hollow. One evening, Walter watched Emma playing cards with Mason and Lucas around the kitchen table and quietly muttered to Bear, "This house finally has laughter again." Bear was silent for a few seconds before looking at Emma with eyes very different from the others. "She deserved that a long time ago," he said softly. The biggest change for Emma wasn't the new house or the college fund. It was the first time in her life she felt there were many adults truly standing behind her to protect her. If Walter's truck broke down, Mason would show up before Emma even had time to worry. If she needed books for school, Bear somehow always knew in advance and sent exactly what was needed. When some older kids at school started teasing Emma about the biker girl, Lucas only needed to pick her up once on his Harley, and no one dared bother her anymore. The biker brotherhood gradually became something Emma had never had in her life. A real found family. Not perfect, sometimes loud and full of scary tattoos, but always there whenever she needed them. They taught Emma how to protect herself, how to fix things around the house, and how to laugh a little louder after years of living too quietly. But the person who changed the most was probably still Bear. Every time he watched Emma running around the backyard with Lily or sitting reading by the fireplace, his eyes always carried an emotion that was both gentle and painful. Something only Walter was old enough to understand. Once Walter caught Bear standing alone on the porch for a long time after everyone had gone to sleep, holding an old photo of Claire from his wallet. "You look at her like a second chance," Walter said softly as he stepped out beside him. Bear was silent for a long time before nodding very slightly. "Maybe because I lost too much before I could fix it." He looked through the window where Emma was dozing off on the sofa with an open book on her chest. "And maybe she is the last chance for me to hold on to the good part still left in me." Walter said nothing more. He just stood beside Bear in the quiet spring night of Appalachia, looking at the warm light shining from the small house at the end of Maple Hollow, a place where one blizzard night had unintentionally created a family that none of them had ever thought they could have again. 1 year after the blizzard night that changed everything, winter returned to Beckley with cold winds blowing across the Appalachians under the gray skies of southern West Virginia. But that small town no longer resembled the place once sunk in despair and silence. Right in the center of Beckley, the old community center that had been abandoned for nearly a decade had now become a brightly lit warm building with new glass doors, a red-tiled roof, and a large sign bearing the words Maple Hope Community Center. The official opening day took place right at the beginning of winter, as if the whole town wanted to turn the memory of last year's blizzard night into the start of something better. People from Beckley poured in, filling the streets around the community center from early morning. Families who for many years had not participated in any community activities also showed up in thick coats with hot cups of coffee in hand. Old veterans sat in rows under the porch. Children ran around the new playground behind the building, and the black Harleys were lined up in front of the parking lot, like a strange but now familiar part of the town. Emma stood next to Walter behind the small stage, set up in front of the community center doors, her two hands gripping the large scissors so tightly that her palms were sweating. The little girl wore the new green coat Bear had sent her at the beginning of winter, her blonde hair neatly tied back by Mrs. Evelyn. "I don't like so many people looking at me like this," Emma whispered anxiously. Walter chuckled softly and adjusted her scarf. "Kiddo," he said in a rare, gentle voice, "in the old days people built statues for those who saved an entire city. You only have to cut one ribbon." Emma laughed a little, even though she was still nervous. When Bear stepped onto the stage with a few representatives from the Mercer Foundation, the whole crowd began to applaud loudly. But what moved many people in Beckley the most was the Hells Angels biker group, standing behind Bear in their familiar patched leather cuts instead of vests or company uniforms. They no longer tried to hide who they were, and for the first time, the town no longer looked at them with fear. Bear held the microphone for a few seconds, then looked down at Emma standing next to Walter. "1 year ago," he said in a deep voice that carried through the freezing air, "the 5 of us nearly died in a blizzard not far from here." The whole crowd listened in silence. A small child living in a house with almost nothing opened the door for us. He looked at Emma and smiled very slightly. "This community center exists because one little girl reminded so many people that kindness still exists." The applause rang out so loudly that Emma's face turned bright red with embarrassment. Then Bear bent down and handed the scissors to the little girl. "Ready, kiddo?" Emma took a deep breath before cutting the red ribbon amid the thunderous cheers of all of Beckley. The doors of the community center opened to prolonged applause, revealing the large, warm, heated room inside, along with the smell of hot soup and freshly baked bread spreading through the air. Walter was then invited up to speak. He stood slowly in front of the microphone in his old coat, but with eyes much brighter than a year ago. "I once thought the most dangerous winter was the one outdoors," he said in his familiar hoarse voice. "But then I realized the real winter is when people stop caring about each other." The whole room fell completely silent. Walter looked around at the attentive faces and continued. "The only kindness that can survive winter is kindness that is shared." A few people in the crowd began wiping away tears after that statement. The rest of the opening ceremony quickly turned into a true community celebration. The bikers in leather cuts stood behind the soup kitchen counter, ladling hot soup for the homeless, veterans, and poor families in town. Mason, wearing a white apron over his leather jacket, made the kids laugh hysterically, while Lucas let Lily sit on the counter, handing out bread like her own little manager. The sight of tattooed bikers serving soup to the elderly under the warm lights of the community center was so strange that many local reporters almost never stopped taking photos. Just a few days later, news stations around West Virginia began running stories about the little girl and the bikers. They told about the blizzard night, about the little girl who opened the door to save 5 Hells Angels bikers, and how that encounter eventually revived an entire small Appalachian town. Emma hated being the center of attention. Every time she saw cameras or reporters approaching, the little girl wanted to hide behind Walter or Bear. "I didn't do anything special," Emma muttered once when she saw her photo in the local newspaper. Walter just gently stroked her hair. "Maybe this story will make someone open their door for another person on some cold night." That statement left Emma silent for a long time. At the end of the ceremony, Bear stepped back onto the stage amid the warm golden lights of the new community center. He announced that the Mercer Foundation would open more winter shelters across Appalachia in the coming years, using Beckley as the first model. "No one should be left out in the cold during winter," Bear said slowly, almost repeating the exact words Walter had taught Emma since she was little. And for the first time in many years, Beckley was no longer mentioned as a dying coal mining town. It became a small symbol of revival, of community, and of the miracle that can happen when one door is opened at the right moment in the coldest winter night. Exactly 1 year after the blizzard night that changed Emma's life and all of Beckley, the Appalachian winter came again with weather warnings that made the whole town remember the old memories. The local radio station continuously announced a new storm moving into southern West Virginia faster than expected. People began rushing to buy food, gas, and firewood just like the year before. But this time Beckley was no longer the panicked and lonely town it once was. The lights from Maple Hope Community Center had been on since early morning, and everyone knew the place would stay open all night for anyone needing a warm shelter. Emma was now much older than the little girl who had stood shivering with a flashlight, opening the door in the blizzard the year before. When she heard the storm was approaching, she immediately asked Walter to let her go to the community center early to help prepare. "I want to stay there tonight," Emma said while putting on her thick coat in front of the mirror. Walter sat in the armchair by the new fireplace. His health was now much better after a year of full treatment. He looked at Emma for a long few seconds, then smiled gently. "Kiddo," he said in a warm, deep voice, "you sound just like your mother every time she wanted to save the whole world." Emma paused slightly when her mother was mentioned. Walter very rarely spoke about his daughter without the heavy sadness like before. He stood up slowly and helped Emma adjust the wool scarf around her neck. "Your mother once believed that the only good thing worth doing was something that made someone less lonely." He looked at the little girl with eyes full of pride. "And now I think she would be very proud of you." Those words made Emma's throat tighten for a few seconds before the little girl hugged her grandfather tightly. By afternoon, the community center had begun to fill with people. Poor families around Beckley, a few elderly veterans living alone, and even truck drivers stranded on the highway were all brought to the new winter shelter. Emma ran around everywhere in an oversized white apron, helping stack blankets, handing out hot chocolate, and stirring large pots of soup in the kitchen with Mrs. Evelyn. Outside, the wind began to howl through the snow-covered streets, while the warm golden light from the community center reflected onto the freezing night like a small lighthouse in Appalachia. Near evening, the familiar sound of Harley engines rang out from the end of the street. Emma ran to the door just in time to see a group of bikers riding through the thick snow into the community center parking lot. Lucas was the first to take off his helmet, followed by Mason, Dean, and a few other bikers Emma had never met before. Behind them were 2 trucks loaded with supplies, blankets, food, heaters, and medicine. "Snow angels are here!" a child shouted loudly, making the whole hall laugh. Mason brushed the snow off his leather jacket shoulder and raised his hand proudly, like an awkward superhero. Just a few minutes later, the biker group had begun carrying boxes of supplies inside, as if they had done this job their whole lives. Lucas helped set up extra cots for the elderly, while Dean checked the list of necessary medicine for the shelter. Emma stood watching the scene with a very strange feeling in her heart. 1 year ago, these men had nearly frozen to death on the road. Now they were riding through the storm to help others. Bear arrived later, nearly an hour after, in the familiar black SUV. When he walked into the community center with his coat covered in snow, he immediately saw Emma helping a small boy wrap a blanket around his shoulders. Bear stood still for a few seconds, then smiled very slowly. "Hey, kiddo." Emma ran over and hugged him as had become the habit over the past year. "You're late," the little girl teased. Bear chuckled softly and looked around the brightly lit community center, where dozens of people were taking shelter from the storm outside. "Look at you," he said quietly. "1 year ago you were the one who needed protecting." He bent down to look straight into Emma's eyes. "Now you're protecting others." That statement left Emma silent for a few seconds. She looked around the room, the elderly drinking hot soup, the children dozing off in blankets, and the tattooed bikers helping hand out food like the most ordinary volunteers in the world. Then Emma suddenly remembered the blizzard night the year before, remembered the small candle flickering in the window of the old house when she opened the door and saw 5 snow-covered men standing on the porch. The community center now was just like that candle, a place lit up in the winter darkness so that lost people would know they had not been abandoned. Emma walked over to the large glass door at the front of the shelter and looked out at the white snow swirling through the streets of Beckley. The wind was still howling fiercely like last year, but this time she no longer felt afraid, because for the first time, she understood that one person's kindness could spread much farther than they had ever imagined. Just one door opened on the coldest night was enough to change an entire town, entire lives, and entire people who once thought their hearts had long been completely frozen. The night grew later, and the blizzard outside Beckley became even more fierce. The wind whipped hard against the window panes of Maple Hope Community Center, sending thick layers of snow swirling like white waves through the Appalachian night. But inside the shelter, the warm golden light stayed on. The smell of hot soup and coffee filled the large room where dozens of people were sleeping temporarily on folding beds. Children curled up in thick blankets near the electric heater. A few old veterans played cards in the corner, and Mason and Lucas were carrying extra firewood into the storage area at the back. Emma had been running around almost nonstop all evening, to the point where Walter had to make her sit down and rest for a few minutes several times. "Kiddo, you can't save the whole world in just one night," Walter grumbled, but his eyes were still full of pride. Emma was just about to reply when, amid the howling wind outside, a sound came from the main door of the community center. 3 loud, heavy, and desperate knocks. The whole room seemed to freeze for a brief moment. Emma stood still for a few seconds, as that sound pulled her right back to the blizzard night a year ago. 3 knocks on the door, echoing through the darkness and cold wind, beginning everything that changed her life forever. The knocking sounded again, weaker than the first time, as if the person outside was almost out of strength. Emma immediately ran toward the front door before Bear could say anything. When she opened the door, cold wind and snow immediately swirled into the lobby. A young woman in her early 20s stood shivering on the porch, holding a small child wrapped in a thin jacket in her arms. Her hair was covered in snow, her lips were blue from the cold, and her eyes were red from panic. Farther down the snow-covered road, the weak flashing hazard lights came from a sedan stuck on the mountain road. "Please," the woman nearly cried out. "My car died. My child is so cold." The child in her arms was about 3 years old, shaking violently and burying their face in their mother's neck. In that moment, Emma saw herself from a year ago in the desperate eyes of that young woman. The feeling of loneliness, fear, and not knowing if anyone else in the world would open the door for her anymore. And just like that night, Emma didn't hesitate for even a second. She stepped fully aside and opened the door as wide as possible. "Come in quickly," the girl called out loudly. "You and the baby will be okay." The young woman nearly collapsed with relief as she stepped into the warmth inside the community center. Lucas immediately ran over to take the child while Mason pulled the door shut to keep the cold wind from pouring in. Emma led the mother and child closer to the heater and wrapped blankets around their shoulders, just like Dean had done for Walter on the blizzard night the year before. "What's your name?" Emma asked the shivering child softly. "Noah," the little boy whispered. Emma smiled very gently and handed him a small cup of hot chocolate. "You're safe now, Noah." The young mother burst into tears right then, not the panicked kind, but the feeling of someone finally allowed to breathe after so many hours of tension and fear. Emma sat beside her, keeping her voice calm even though she was only 12 years old. "It's okay," the girl said softly. "No one gets left out in the cold here during winter." That statement made Bear, standing a few meters away, pause. He quietly watched Emma caring for the mother and child under the shelter's golden lights, with an expression Walter had never seen on him before, one of pride, emotion, and also pain, as if he had finally seen something truly good continue to exist after all the losses in his life. Bear slowly walked over and stood next to Walter near the heater. The 2 men silently watched Emma bending down to wrap another blanket around the small boy. Walter finally smiled gently and leaned back in his chair. "She learns fast," he muttered. Bear nodded very slightly, but his eyes never left Emma. "No," he said softly. "She's just always been that kind of person." Walter looked at the fire reflecting in the community center's glass door and unconsciously remembered the small wooden house at the end of Maple Hollow A. Year ago, remembered the faint candle in the window and the little girl holding a flashlight as she opened the door in the blizzard. Now, that candle had become an entire brightly lit shelter in the Appalachian winter night, a place where people with nowhere else to go knew they would not be abandoned in the cold. and Walter understood that kindness had finally found its successor. The community center was no longer just a charity project or a gift from the Mercer Foundation. It had become what Beckley needed most, a real home for those in despair during winter. Outside, the storm continued to roar through the snow-covered streets, but inside the warm light of the shelter, Emma looked at the young mother hugging her small child tightly in the blanket and finally understood that kindness never truly ends. It is only passed from one person to another, like a small flame that continues to be kept alive through the coldest winters of human life. Emma quickly brought a bowl of hot soup from the kitchen counter to the young mother sitting near the heater with her small child in her arms. Outside the large glass doors of Maple Hope Community Center, snow was still falling so heavily that it nearly swallowed the entire street of Beckley in pure white. The wind slammed against the glass in fierce gusts, just like the blizzard night a year ago, when Emma was still a little girl shivering with a flashlight as she opened the door of the house at the end of Maple Hollow. But this time, everything was different. The community center was brightly lit with golden lights. The smell of hot soup and bread filled the large room, and the soft sounds of conversation mixed with children's laughter made it feel more like a real home than anything else. Emma set the bowl of soup down in front of the young woman and pulled the thicker blanket around her shoulders. The small child named Noah had stopped shaking and was now dozing off in his mother's arms after drinking the hot chocolate. The woman looked at Emma with eyes red from exhaustion and emotion. "Thank you," she choked out. "I really didn't know what I would do if I hadn't found this place." Emma sat down beside her and smiled gently, a smile much softer than her 12 years of age. "My grandpa always says," the girl spoke slowly, "no one gets left out in the cold during winter." That statement made the woman suddenly burst into tears. Not the panicked crying from earlier on the porch, but the feeling of relief when someone finally believes that she and her child are truly safe after many days of living in fear. She hugged Noah tighter and bowed her head, unable to stop saying thank you. Emma just gently rubbed her back the way Mrs. Evelyn used to do with her when she was little. From the other side of the room, Bear stood silently watching the scene beside the community kitchen counter. The golden light reflected on his weathered face as Emma bent down to adjust the blanket for Noah with her small but very gentle hands. In that moment, Bear suddenly understood what perhaps all of Beckley had begun to realize long ago. Emma was no longer just the little girl who had once saved a few bikers in a blizzard. She had become the heart of this entire community. People came to Maple Hope Community Center not only for warm shelter or a bowl of hot soup. They came because here, there was someone who truly saw them as human beings, just like the way Emma had looked at Bear and his brothers on that blizzard night a year ago. Walter sat beside the large heater in the corner of the room, a wool blanket across his legs and a hot cup of coffee in his hand. He quietly observed Emma moving from person to person, helping hand out blankets, serving soup, and bending down to talk to the small children who were scared by the sound of the wind outside. A slow smile appeared on Walter's aged face. For many years he had feared he wouldn't have enough time to teach Emma enough before his health took him away from her life. But now, watching how Emma cared for others with all the natural kindness inside her, Walter finally understood that the things he had tried so hard to preserve throughout his life had truly continued to live on in her. It wasn't money or a new house that lasted the longest. It was kindness passed from one person to another through the coldest winters. Near the community kitchen, the group of bikers sat around a long table eating hot soup amid quiet conversation. Mason still wore his patched leather cut but had an additional white apron over it, making a few children giggle every time they looked at him. Lucas sat beside Lily, who was dozing off on his shoulder, while Dean drank coffee and played chess with an old veteran who had just arrived at the shelter that night. The scene was so strange that if anyone in Beckley from 2 years ago had seen it, they would surely think they were dreaming. The bikers who had once been considered the most frightening in town were now sitting in the community kitchen serving soup to the homeless like a loud but warm big family. And for one very brief moment, everything felt just like the first night they had taken shelter in Emma's small house. Still the sound of winter wind outside the door. Still the warmth of hot soup, and the feeling of strangers gradually becoming family to one another. Bear finally walked over and sat down next to Walter near the heater. The two men silently watched Emma smiling at Noah on the other side of the room. That girl changed this whole town, Bear said quietly. Walter chuckled softly. No, he replied slowly. She only opened the door. Outside, the storm continued to cover Beckley in white snow, the winter wind still howling through the freezing Appalachian roads just as it had for hundreds of years. But inside Maple Hope Community Center was the warm golden light reflecting on the glass doors, the sound of people talking, children laughing, and the feeling of peace that desperate people often thought they would never find again. Emma stood near the window for a few seconds and looked out at the white snow outside. She remembered the night she opened the small door of the old house years ago, when she simply thought that no one should be left out in the cold during winter. She had never imagined that small decision could lead to everything that existed today. A brightly lit community center, in the middle of a blizzard, people being helped, a revived town, and a family she never thought she would have. And perhaps life always begins to change in that way. Not through grand things or perfect people, but only through the moment when one person decides to open the door at the right time for someone freezing in the darkness. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue to explore emotional stories about kindness, humanity, and miracles in everyday life together. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey, and see you again in the next story, under the warm lights, amid the coldest winters.